Hello, welcome to Underlord's Universe. I got my compadre here, my cohort. Cohort, is that the right word? I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll make it work.
something.
I think it's good.
It's good. So we are part of a group of guys who are involved in a creative conclave, a creative process, a creative endeavor that we refer to as Underlords of the Overworld. We write music under the name H. Prescott Lemon. That guy writes novels and stories. If you've just stumbled across this channel, we've done a lot of music reviews and music discussions. This one is on fiction. It's on weird tales. And if you'd like to support our channel, please subscribe. I think we have some interesting conversations around here in the Underlords.
Yeah, we've definitely had a lot of interesting conversations around music and the music we love.
Mm-hmm.
And that plays into how you, as you were saying, we really make this universe of music and stories that intertwine. And I think that it's yeah, it's like that. And I think it's really uh valuable and interesting for us to talk a little bit about stories. And Weird Tales is kind of the starting point for that.
Mm-hmm.
Weird Tales, as you can see, I've got some posters back there, and I think that Weird Tales really influenced me, kind of that genre
Yeah,
of horror, science fantasy. And I think these stories often get overlooked because they're pulp.
right.
But I think there's a surprising amount of depth
So,
in these stories. And I think that it is a good opportunity to just talk about that.
so here's kind of how I think we're going to do this. First, we're going to just briefly talk about the concept of the weird tales,
Hmm.
and where we've selected a particular weird tale published in 1947 called Eena, and we're going
Yep.
to just talk about Eena and the idea of a main character built off of a twist off of an archetype, and then we'll close out discussing just briefly a little bit about the published work of H. Prescott Lemon and where you can access that if you'd like to support us. We'd really appreciate it. So, Weird Tales. I think Weird Tales, I think first published, you pointed out the magazine posters behind you. I think it's 1923.
1923.
And there were
And
fits and starts throughout, but it's primarily starting in the 20s, and then the peak of it, I think, is the 1930s during the Great Depression. Um, and then on into the 1940s, and you got, a range of really, really well-known authors. Um, Robert Bloch, Ray Bradbury, um,
Clark Ashton Smith.
okay, Clark Ashton Smith, who I'm less familiar with, Robert E. Howard, of course, of Conan fame. And since then, there have been lots of volumes published with reprinted the stories. I particularly love that cover, this Weird Tales. Yes,
Yeah.
that hardback edition. This is great. This is edited by Marvin Kay, who he was an author himself, and he was a co-editor of Weird Tales. He passed away only a couple of years ago,
Mm,
age
yeah.
83. And lots of different. There's a series of a 4 volume series, which is, you can still find on eBay and elsewhere. So what we're going to be doing is taking stories from these collections and elsewhere. I mentioned Ray Bradbury. You've got Ray Bradbury, even Stephen King, who is a huge, huge fan of these pulp
The Weird Tale.
stories. Yeah, of weird tales. When I read a Stephen King short story, it's like this thing could have been in a Weird Tales magazine.
Yeah.
So that's where we're pulling all this stuff from. We've got so much at our disposal that we'll never get through all of it. But I was particularly taken by the story Eena when I started going through this volume here. And I think I said something to you about it, and
Yeah,
and
you turned me onto the story, which
yeah,
which I appreciate because it's definitely an interesting one and an interesting take on the werewolf tale.
yeah. And as I think we started talking about it, I think I just said, let's just do this over Zoom and put it up and to see if anybody out there that is interested in short stories, weird tales, etc. Have you read it? do you have any comments on it? If you see this and you think it's interesting and you end up picking it up and reading it yourself, what's your take on it? Because I'm learning, I think this is one of the great things about, getting to the age that we're at. I've, I don't know if I would have gone down as many of these rabbit holes without you and me working together on creative stuff. And it's just
Likewise.
opened up different authors and different ways of exploring the creative mind and the creative world. So yeah. So Eena, it is. You want to get started? You want to give
Let's
me
talk about the story. Yeah,
so so you mentioned it's a take on the werewolf story, and it
yeah.
certainly is, but it's a twist, right?
Well, and you were talking about archetypes before we started, and I
Yeah.
know that you have some thoughts around archetypes with this particular story. So,
Hmm.
um, go ahead. What are
Well,
your thoughts on how does this resonate with you
yeah.
from an
Okay.
archetype
So
perspective?
so the thing that we want to try to avoid here, like with this discussion, I'd like to try to avoid just telling the story.
You
And
bet.
I think if somebody is interested in it, they should read it. But first of all, it was written by an author named Manly Banister. It was published in 1947. And, as we mentioned before,
Published in Weird Tales in 1947,
published
September
in,
of
yes,
47, I believe.
September of 1947, published in Weird Tales. And Weird Tales was known as what they called a pulp, as opposed to like a glossy or a slick. And
Yeah.
that's a reference to the cheaper quality of the paper that the magazines were published on. So they were kind of seen as, I don't know, lesser
Oh
publications,
yeah. Yeah.
and but really interesting and bizarre ideas that are published in here. And this is one of them, of course. And the traditional idea of a werewolf, of course, is that a person changes into a werewolf, and as they or once they change into a werewolf, they take on all of those wolf qualities. But in Ena, you have a character who is a wolf that turns into a person.
Yeah.
But so okay, so it's like really it's like a were human.
Yeah. It's a strange pivot
But
from the tradition. Um,
yes, and here's where this is the heart of my question for you, and what I wanted to get your take on. Because when I think about twisting a classic concept, I just think in terms of parallels. Okay, so it's like if a person turns into a werewolf, they act like a wolf. But in this case, it's not a perfect parallel because the character turns into from a wolf into a person, but they don't really act like a person. They act like a wolf that's
in human form.
in human form. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if I had come up with this idea, I wouldn't have twisted it like that, because I'm personally just constantly thinking of flip this around, flip that around, because I'm too simple-minded. And Manly Bannister, when he wrote this, obviously he realized that this story wasn't going to work if it was a perfect parallel. So he had to make his own creative twist on the archetype of the werewolf. And so I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that, because that's what ran through my head when I read the story.
Yeah. And I mean, archetypes are these encompassing ideas that just resonate, with psychologically with people. That's kind of how I think of an archetype. And I think what's really fun to do is to take an archetype and to just pivot it a little bit, and I think that's perfect, and it relates to what a lot of weird tales do. I think a lot of weird tales kind of transcend genre and therefore take archetypes and just nudge them a little bit. And you think about the archetype of the werewolf, and that is, you know, becoming one with this other kind of form of life,
Hmm.
and or giving into your animal nature and becoming something else. And to me, that's kind of the transition from human to werewolf is embracing that animal nature. I think what struck me in the story from an archetype perspective, when you think about human animal, is both the characters in this story, uh, the primary characters, Joel Cameron, who's the guy who goes to this cabin and ends up meeting this, this wolf that turns into a woman. They're both outsiders. So to me, the archetype that's at work here is the archetype of the outsider.
Ah,
Because
interesting. Okay. I
Joel Cameron,
didn't think of it
he's
like
an
that.
outsider. He doesn't really exist. He's a writer. He's I think he's actually a Weird Tales writer. I think that's kind of what he is,
The
or
character,
publishes
the
some sort of
character of
stories.
yeah.
So when he
Okay.
goes to the city, he never quite fits in there because he doesn't have a steady job. He doesn't fit into the society of the city. So he comes to this cabin, this old cabin that he has. I think it's been in his family or something. And he doesn't really fit in there either because he's not one of the people that lives in that part of, the wherever he goes out into the country. So
Hmm.
he doesn't really fit in the city. He doesn't really fit, um, in this, he's kind of an outsider in both places. So that's kind of this existence that he lives. And then he comes upon this wolf that turns into a woman. She's an outsider as well. She's neither wolf, even though she kind of becomes the leader of this pack, these
Hmm.
wolves know she's different. She's not like them. And at the same time, she's not a person either. You said she doesn't act like a person. So she's neither person nor wolf. He's in this weird world of, I don't really fit in the city, and I definitely don't fit out here in this nature place.
Can I interject for because this is exactly why I love having these conversations because I've read Ena twice. And you mentioned the concept of the archetype resonating on a psychological level. I would go one step further now that you pointed some things out to me that I hadn't thought of, almost on a subconscious level.
Yeah.
Because when you characterized the main character, Joel, as an outsider, it was like, yes, I didn't even notice that, but I think on a subconscious level, I might have. But I didn't consciously think about it. And that's actually really, really important in maybe understanding the story on a certain level, but for it to resonate, I didn't even have to understand it. I just had to relate to that character. And I,
Yeah.
here and there feel like a bit of an outsider myself. And so I think that's one reason why I really gravitated towards this story. And to that point, even though she is a werewolf, werehuman kind of creature, it's not a horror story.
No.
It's a tragic tale, and in a sense, it's an emotional, almost a romantic kind of tale.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, case in point, this is why I like having these conversations because it opens up an angle that I hadn't thought of before, and that's I think valuable.
Well, and the tension is created through the use of this archetype. And you'd mentioned, it's not a horror story. And
Hmm.
certainly there are weird tales that are horror stories, and certainly there are weird tales that are sci-fi stories or fantasy stories. But I think that one of the things that I really love about weird tales is how they blend these genres in a lot of the ways that we, as the underlords of the overworld, blend our different creative styles.
Hmm.
It's not just saying like progressive music or fantasy stories. It's blending a lot of things together, and that creates some very strange angles. And the story Enid does that really brilliantly, and it creates a lot of tension because the archetype of the outsider, he's an outsider. Whether you recognize that overtly or it's more playing in your subconscious, you recognize they're both outsiders, and you're like, oh yeah, they if they could just be together, if they could just be together,
Mm-hmm.
that would be that would be the happy ending. We won't give any spoilers away, but
Yeah.
there's definitely a twist at the end with how that plays out. So
Yeah.
again, I would recommend that people read this, but it's just a great example of, again, I talked at the beginning about how people overlook weird tales. It's kind of like, oh, is this old pulpy crap?
Hmm.
But when you really start to get into these stories, a lot of these stories have, I think, a really interesting level of depth with what they're trying to convey.
Hmm.
So I'm excited to talk about more of these stories.
Yeah. Definitely. We'll settle on another one here pretty soon, I guess. Maybe maybe off camera. Keep it a surprise. But so that's, to me, that's the heart of the Ena story. The twist on the archetype of a werewolf. Now that I see it from what you're saying, it's a story of outsiders. And like you said, we don't want to give anything away. If you've read Ena and you know what we're talking about, put a comment in. We'd like to hear what people have to say. Speaking of what people have to say, I know you have your own notes on this. Were there other things, other angles on the story beyond this outsider archetypal element that you had noticed?
Um, the outsider thing was what I primarily took away. I
Okay.
hadn't really thought about that relating to the concept of the archetype. So I kind of came in with that thought more from a plot perspective, but hadn't really applied it. So again, it's a valuable conversation to talk about this stuff. So you know, that's kind of what the theme of the story is for me, is this outsiders
Mm.
and the need for that outsiders sometimes have to belong, and how hard it can be for outsiders to belong
Yeah.
sometimes, as we may or may not see in the story. But even if you don't want to look at it that deep, it's just a fun story to read. It's a fun story. So, I think that whether it's music or stories, you can look at them with whatever level of depth you want. A lot of people don't like to look too deeply at these things. They just like to let music be in the background, or they just read a story and move on, and that's fine. That's great. This is certainly a story that you can gloss over and read it and be like, that's cool, or look into some of the deeper meaning behind it. So
That's a good point. When you are writing and you're thinking about a classic kind of character, a werewolf, vampire, whatever, a cryptid, etc. How do you, as a writer, tend to think in terms of the twist? Because I know you don't ever want to just simply have something be stereotypical.
yeah, I think it has to kind of happen organically, but I think there's always this impulse because, again, kind of writing between genres or blending genres, I think it's always a question of, if I want to have a character that's a vampire, that's cool because there's a lot of vampire characters out there.
Hmm.
But what can I do to make that character just a little different? So what can I blend it with? I think it's always a matter of what one of these things is not like the other, and how can I put them together? So, and the character we're talking about. We're talking about Vukadlak, the vampire, who
Yeah.
appears in several of the stories and throughout the Underworld's universe that we've created. But he's a vampire who writes vampire fiction and doesn't really, not the best actual vampire, but loves to write those vampire stories and create those stories. And I think that it's always fun to say, well, there's this, but how do we make it just different? How do we
Hmm.
how do we make it so it's unexpected?
Hmm.
And that's always a fun process. You know, I think it's fun to make these things absurd in a way.
Well, that's
You
kind
know,
of a mentality approach. You have a bit of an eye to the absurd. And a lot of people want straight up horror, or they want straight up terror,
right.
or whatever. And I think it's just in your nature to just notice the absurd. And that, I think, is what makes some of your writing really entertaining.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And we're both kind of absurd people.
Hmm.
And I think that makes its way into the music as well as the stories, and
Hmm.
that's, I think, why the project is so much fun for us to make these things, like, because even the music, if and I
Yeah.
would urge people to go out and check out our music as well, because what genre is it? It's heavy, it's a little progressive, but I don't know if either heavy metal or progressive rock would claim what we do. There's some
No.
funk in there, there's weird stuff in there. And so I think that it's a very similar approach between the stories and the music of, let's not just pick one thing. Let's try to pick everything that we like and throw it in together and make it weird, like
Yeah.
a weird tale.
Well, and that's definitely where I think originality comes from, because there's really nothing entirely new under the sun. We all know that. But the question is your take on it new? Is your take on it um, inspired and entertaining?
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay, cool. Do you want to just make a quick note about the H. Prescott Lemon output in Amazon? And
Yeah, so and I don't have all of them,
it's all right.
but two oh look at that. Two primary series in the Underlords universe, literary universe. Underlords of the Overworld, is a fictional alternate parallel universe of our experience as a band, which has been a lot of fun. And again, it's very absurd. The adventures of a band that as teenagers accidentally sells their souls to a lesser demon and all of the hijinks that ensue as a result of that. So again, that's one line of stories out there, and these are available on Amazon,
Hmm.
both as print and as ebooks. And then OAO is a series that spun out of that about again kind of an absurd group of occult misfits who form a secret society that subcontracts with the United States government to solve esoteric mysteries. And again, just a bizarre, fun. It's intended to be fun, uh, you know, group of stories. As of today, officially today, just published a collection of short stories called "Smaller Than Death" that you co-authored one of those stories and rescued one of
Mm.
those stories from the discard pile.
Oh,
So
that's right.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that's in there, and I'm excited to talk about that and to get that out there as well. So yeah, I mean, if you're into weird tales and weird stories and have a taste for the absurd, then please feel free to jump out to Amazon, H. Prescott Lemon, and you'll find
Mhm.
those sets out there. So
Right.
I hope you do, and happy reading. And check
Yeah.
out the Underlords. Shannon, do you want to talk a little bit about the music? Because I think that these
Um,
go hand in hand.
yeah, it's just the basic idea. I think the story of the Underlords, the kind of fictional alternate universe story, was an outgrowth of us as full-grown guys, trying to get back into playing music as we were as kids, and just kind of in our kind of bizarre fantasy mindset, a lot of what if? Well, what if when we were kids it had happened like this? And what if when we were kids it had happened like that? And you just started going with it, and it was one thing after the other, and that's where the original stories came from. And it was like, well, we couldn't really keep a drummer. We can't find a vocalist. So we're playing this original instrumental rock stuff, and who's going to know what or understand what this is? And so all that stuff came from that. And I'm in the process, excuse me. Oh, I'm in the process of trying to learn how to put up through Bandcamp access to the actual physical things. These are actually called CDs.
CDs. We grew up
CD.
with them.
And I think they still make players, although you're hard pressed to find any in an automobile these days. But nonetheless, it's all available for streaming, Underlords of the Overworld. And Bandcamp is, of course, our preferred place rather than something like Spotify, just simply because if somebody wanted to, they could actually buy it, and help support in the independent art that we're creating. And
Yeah.
but at this point now, we actually have a vocalist who is a multi-instrumentalist, and we actually have two drummers. The whole story of our lives is we can't find a drummer. Now we have two of them, both of them multi-instrumentalists, both of them run recording studios. So we're really fortunate. And we're writing more and recording more music. And we're on the ground level of a whole new project that really we think is going to blend music and story together in a way that we
Even
hadn't
more.
yet before. So if you've uh if you're still with us, please check out our stuff. And we're going to do another episode here at some point on another weird tale. Once we hit stop on the record button, we'll talk about what
Yeah.
stories to go to next. So
Weird
okay.
music, weird stories. Welcome to our midlife crisis.
Yeah, as I like to say, midlife renaissance,
Ah, yes.
renaissance. I mean, midlife
Renaissance.
renaissance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Renaissance.
So, okay. Anything else you want to say?
No, this has been fun.
Okay. All right. Until next time, ciao.
So.